It's my pleasure and distinct honor to welcome you to the 4th annual E. Victor Wolfenstein Memorial Lecture. Held annually, this lecture brings together scholars doing innovative work on the fundamental questions of justice, race, history, and their representation in theory, music, and literature that animated Victor's scholarship. I'd like to particularly thank Judy Wolfenstein and Gabe Wolfenstein for their efforts and vision that led to the creation of this lecture. So thank you, Judy and Gabe. It's really hard to imagine that it's been almost exactly 6 years since Victor's passing. Really miss him very much, and we're so very proud to be able to continue his mission through this lecture and through the incredible folks that we've had to come give the lecture, including Robert Gooding-Williams and Lori Balfour and Charles Mill, and this year with Eddie Glaude Jr. Immediately following the program, we'll have a reception outside, and we invite everyone to join in the discussion at that time. I'd like to particularly thank our tremendous staff members, our Chief Administrative Officer, Stephanie Ariaza, and our event coordinator, Belinda Sunu, and our great development staff for doing the hard work of putting today's events together. As we move forward here, what I will do is I will introduce Melvin Rogers, who will then introduce our speaker today. So today's speaker will be, as I say, introduced by Melvin Rogers. And Melvin is the Scott Waugh Professor of Social Science, and he's jointly appointed in the Department of Political Science and also in the Department of African American Studies. Melvin's research is in the area of political philosophy with a focus on little d democratic and little r Republican theory, American and African American political thought, and issues of religion, race, and gender. He's the author of The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Mortality, and the Ethos of Democracy, and his articles appear in such prestigious outlets as Political Theory, the American Political Science Review, and Philosophy and Social Criticism. Ladies and gentlemen, Melvin Rogers.
Well, I am delighted to see all of you here on a Friday in LA, right? So thank you all for coming. So before I turn to my formal introductory comments, I want to sort of tell you a brief story. So a couple of weeks ago, I was at home and I was going through some old papers looking for some documents. And I came across an envelope. And on the front of the envelope, it said grades. So I thought this was grades for some of my students. So I went into the envelope and I pulled out these cards. And the second card that I looked at, the sort of second course on the card, said religious studies, moral and religious thought in moral and political thought in African American history, and then the instructor's name was Eddie Glaude. Right? And one of the things I came to realize at that moment, and perhaps I've always known this, is that from that sort of very hour in which I took this class with Eddie Glaude way back when, in 1996 at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, that from that very first hour, I suppose until this very hour, that I came to realize that all of the questions that I have found myself asking and trying to answer from that time to this one is owed to that class in 1996. And it is quite extraordinary, I think, when you're able to chart the origins of not only the questions that you find yourself asking, but also the intellectual habits and skills needed to, at a minimum, wrestle with those questions. And at that moment, you come to realize that both the experience and the person who provided you with that experience turns out actually to be a wonderful intellectual gift. Right? So Eddie S. Glaude Jr. is currently the chair of the Department of African American Studies and the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. It is not a stretch, I think, to claim that he now hails as one of the most important Black intellectuals in the United States today. Again and again, Glaude offers critical and insightful views on the problems currently facing Black America. But the central themes, I think, that run throughout Glaude's work, perhaps not always acknowledged by himself, involve him in seeing the American polity as what we might think of as an aesthetic production, an outcome of invention and discursive exchange, and his commitment to what we might call the perfectionist thread that runs throughout American and African American moral, religious, and political thought. And I tend to think that this sort of perfectionist thread is a claim that who we are now need not determine who we may yet become. Yeah? The first of these elements, seeing the American polity as an aesthetic production, is so clearly on display, I think, in his first book, Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America, published by the University of Chicago in 2000. A winner of the William Sanders Scarborough Prize, the Exodus book makes a persuasive and I think compelling case for seeing the Exodus story as central to early 19th century African American discourse and its idea of nationhood. As he explains, quote, Exodus is a metaphor for a conception of nation that begins with the common social heritage of slavery and the insult of discrimination, and evolves into a set of responses on the part of people acting for themselves to alleviate their conditions, end quote. It provides a picture of self-understanding through which African Americans reimagine their relationship to each other and, dare I say, the American polity. In his 2007 book, In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, Glaude combined this aesthetic view, I would claim, of the polity with what we might call its perfectionist undercurrents. Perfectionism, as Ralph Waldo Emerson famously understood, is the process of what Emerson called ascension, or the passage of the soul into higher forms. In that work, Glaude makes a plea for African Americans to address their social problems by recourse to experience on the one hand, and with an eye set on the promise and potential of the future, rather than being enslaved by the fixed categories of the past. Combining the insights of pragmatism, the pragmatism of John Dewey, and the tradition of African American political thought and activism, Glaude writes the following, quote, to embrace pragmatism is to hold close a fundamental faith in the capacities of ordinary people to transform their circumstances while rejecting hidden and not so hidden assumptions that would deny them that capacity. To bind pragmatism and African American politics together, I hope to show, he says, is to open up new avenues for thinking about both, thus providing, he claims, the transformation and elevation of the polity. And indeed, that book is actually quite successful in laying out a new path for African American politics. But it is with his most recent text, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves American Soul, published by Crown Press in 2016, that Glaude has made his most direct intervention in American politics. So central has this text become to recent conversations around Black politics and presidential politics that it has secured him regular spots on shows such as MSNBC and Democracy Now! In that work, perhaps his most ambitious to date, I think, he argues that we must take seriously that we live in a country founded on what he calls the value gap, the way in which white lives are valued more than others. This value gap, he continues, distorts both American politics generally, but Black politics specifically, making the latter complicit in the subordination and exploitation of the Black community. The value gap is quite literally constitutive of our identity, locating itself in the habits and sensibilities of those with whom we share the polity. As he writes, quote, we talk about the achievement gap in education or the wealth gap between white Americans and other groups, but the value gap reflects something more basic, that no matter our stated principles or how much progress we think we've made, white people are valued more than others in this country, and that fact continues to shape the life chances of millions of Americans. The value gap is in our national DNA, end quote. And nothing short of a revolution of values and a refusal to be the handmaiden of a system of political representation that exploits Black people will generate, he claims, a transformed political and moral life. As he says in his rejection of the cult of political leadership that dominates our idea of representation, quote, the idea of politics I'm suggesting that I am offering here assumes a different kind of leadership. It insists on the capacities and responsibilities of everyday ordinary Black people and urges them to reach for a higher self, even in opportunity deserts. Those deserts are fertile ground to be politically creative. They are the places in which we can think, reflect, and act anew. And the very call to think, reflect, and act anew on American soil actually struggles under the weight of the enormity and complexity of the problem he describes so carefully throughout the book that, as he says, is in the DNA of the nation. This, I submit to you, is not actually a drawback of the book, but an honest confrontation with, as he says in the subtitle of the book, how race still enslaves the American soul. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce this year's Wolfenstein lecturer, Glaude Jr., who will discuss with us today the limits of Black liberalism and the 2016 presidential election.
Well, you know you're getting old. Oh, I remember those Bowdoin days. Thank you, Melvin. Thank you, Jeff, for that, for the opportunity, and all of you for being here. It's really a pleasure and an honor to share with you some thoughts. I'm actually kind of overwhelmed by the introduction from Melvin. He is a careful reader of my work, and that's always humbling. But it's just a marvel to kind of watch someone that you've been around for so long emerge as a towering intellectual, doing amazing work. And we got to see Dr. Strange last night, so I'm really happy. It's good to see old friends. Sarah, it's good to see you here, and it's good to share a little of Los Angeles sunshine, because it is not sunshining in New Jersey. So let me just jump into this, right? We don't have much time, right? Is that okay? So Ralph Waldo Emerson suggests that God speaks to us through our imaginations. As Emerson writes in Poetry and Imagination, quote, God himself does not speak prose, but communicates with us by hints, omens, inference, and dark resemblances and objects lying around us, end quote. God speaks to us through our imaginations. And I often ask my students, if this is true, then what is the devil doing? In so many ways, what we are experiencing in this moment, so defined by the mediocrity of the political landscape, is a crisis of imagination. A crisis of imagination. And I mean by this something more than a failure to be creative, rather that something about who we are has gone out of focus. Some sort of major failing defines our way of being in the world. And I hope that what I have to say here will live up to what I've come to learn as the legacy of Victor Wolfenstein, right? So thank you for making this possible. To my mind, imagination registers much more than creativity or the ability to trade in that which isn't real, something like the fantastical. Think about that moment in Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. A man, quote, to be greatly good must imagine intensely, Shelley writes, and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, end quote. Here, imagination involves an ability to see the as yet, to see beyond the opacity, a willingness to see beyond the opacity of one's condition, to envision the possible. Now, I've written about this elsewhere. as another way of talking about the prophetic. That is, the imagination in the exercise of critical intelligence, which envisions the possible as a basis to critique and dismantle the current limits of one's current circumstances. In John Dewey's work, this gets rendered as dramatic rehearsal, right? But I think imagination also involves empathetic projection, what John Dewey describes as that animating moral judgment, that is, feeling our way beyond the narrow consideration of ours alone to take up the concerns and aspirations of others. So the imagination isn't just about the world as it is or as it could be. It is also about who we take ourselves to be and how that sense of ourselves emerges in our shared experience with others, particularly those who are not seen as one of us. Today we find ourselves in these dark times, unable, or at least we find it difficult to imagine otherwise. The world as it is seems to be our permanent docking station. This glaring state of affairs not only blocks our ability to see the possible, it impairs our ability to empathize with those who are not us. So we live in a time where the superordinate value seems to be, at least to me, putting oneself over and against another. Witness Donald Trump and all that follows from him, right? And it seems, and perhaps this reflects my own deepening despair, that certain iterations of black politics suffer from a similar crisis. Not so much a failure to empathize with others, but certainly an inability to see the possible. We, that is black folk, seem to be stuck in the box. Stuck in the box. Now, for most of the 20th century, African American politics consisted of a wide range of ideologies that challenged white supremacy in this country. In the early 20th century, the NAACP, the National Urban League, and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs stood alongside organizations like Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association and the National Negro Congress and the Council on African Affairs. Black liberals struggled alongside black nationalists and communists, people who conceived of black political life beyond the borders of the United States and who pushed up against any easy embrace of the belief that no matter our practices, America was a place committed to freedom, equality, and the rights of every person. Black nationalists and communists seriously questioned American exceptionalism. Activists like Cyril Briggs and Hubert Harrison, Harry Haywood, Claudia Jones, and Paul Robeson offered a radical critique of the nation and linked that criticism with the conditions of black and brown people around the globe. They joined with Du Bois in insisting on a deeper understanding of the relationship between capitalism, white supremacy, and empire. Their presence, and many, of course, were West Indian immigrants, enriched the black political landscape as they worked with and alongside black liberals to challenge white supremacy at home and abroad. Now, much of this radical energy would fall victim to the Cold War and the push for consensus. In January of 1948, the U.S. Attorney General Tom Clark made clear the stakes. Quote, "Those who do not believe in the ideology of the United States shall not be allowed to stay in the United States." End quote. McCarthyism led to the persecution of figures like Du Bois and Robeson. Du Bois was arrested as an agent of a foreign principal in February of 1951. At the age of 82, he was handcuffed and fingerprinted. The national media made him out to be a common criminal. His books taken from shelves in the Atlanta University Center and at Tuskegee and Hampton. He had to be rediscovered in interesting sorts of ways. Robeson lost his ability to travel abroad and to perform. He died broken and alone. The upshot was that any hint of communism or socialism, black politics, shaping black politics had to be purged, and the radical elements of black political life marginalized. Black liberalism had to stand alone. Now, this desire, this politics has come to pass in our own time, I think. Black liberalism has to stand alone. Now, no wonder the popular story of black politics in the 20th century begins with the founding of the NAACP, popular story, right? The popular story. Begins with the founding of the NAACP, makes a brief mention of the Harlem Renaissance, documents court cases that end with the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, and finally culminates with the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech in 1963, and of course, Obama's election. It's as if nothing happened in the 1930s and 1940s of significance, as if the radical elements of the 1960s and 1970s did not matter at all. It's going to be interesting as we kind of think about the 50th anniversary of the Black Power movement of the Black Panther Party and how that's represented in popular discourse. Now, obviously, I can invoke Michael Dawson's account of what's happened, the shifts in material conditions that lead to this narrowing. We think about state repression and COINTELPRO. We think about transformations in political economy. We can think about ideological consolidation, all having an impact on the form and content of black political life. But what I want to focus on for this moment, for this brief time we have together, is what I'm thinking of as a kind of discursive narrowing. A discursive narrowing. Part of the problem has been a narrowing of what is politically possible. Over the years, the broad sweep of black political life has been winnowed down to what some take to be the only acceptable form of black politics, black liberalism. This has involved an all-out assault on our radical political imaginations. All we are left to do is quote-unquote tinker with the current system. Other forms of black politics are seen not just as unacceptable, but as damaging. The Black Power movement gets reduced to an orgy of violence or simply a demand for black cultural recognition. Blotted from view are the complexities of Malcolm X, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panther Party. These were people and organizations who sought to uproot white supremacy in every facet of American society. They insisted that black was beautiful and that poor black people should participate fully in the democratic process, and they challenged economic arrangements that exploited black communities. Malcolm and groups like these come to us now in movies like The Butler and Selma, where they represent an irrational, angry politics that seems completely out of bounds because it heightens white fear and fails to understand how real politics works. Remember that moment in Selma where Dr. King has to, in some ways, school Snick in that moment, right? Under these conditions, how can we recall the importance of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement or the League of Revolutionary Black Workers or the radicalism of the African Liberation Support Committee? These end up seeming like residual traces of bad politics. Right? Truncated political imaginations give us limited political options. We imagine what's possible within a narrow band of options provided by a political philosophy that for all intents and purposes is, in my mind, bankrupt when it comes to fundamentally changing black lives. Black liberalism ends up being the only game in town. Now, the election of Barack Obama should be understood as the logical conclusion of a form of black politics that has guided much of African American life since the dawn of the 20th century. You can draw a straight line from the founding of the NAACP in 1909 and the National Urban League in 1910 to Obama's political ascendance. There are real differences between these moments, and a lot, of course, has happened between them. Y'all all right? I hate just talking at people. Y'all good? You listening to me? Because you're not just bored, right? Am I? All right, that's a little Baptist minister just came out. A little Morehouse in me, right? Just wanted to check in on you. Okay, good. Right. And you can't draw a straight line from the founding of the NAACP in 1909 to Obama. There are real differences. What connects them, however, is, I think, the underlying political philosophy of black liberalism, a view that takes broad-based inclusion of black people into American life as its aim without closing what Melvin rightly described in my work, the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others. Now, Obama's politics reflects a set of guiding principles about the role of government in our lives and a commitment to a framework of rights and fair procedures that accord equal respect and standing to individuals. Individuals are seen as independent, rational actors who are capable of, quote, choosing their own values and ends, end quote. And in this sense, Obama, like most black liberals, is no different from any white liberal in the country. Now, by liberal, I don't mean someone on the political left. Right? I simply mean that Obama adheres to a very old political tradition that can be traced back to the likes of Locke and John Stuart Mill, right? The two Johns, right? He's committed to individual rights, to relatively free markets, and to an idea of government that, all things being equal, is minimally intrusive in our individual efforts to maximize our ambitions. Most Americans, whether they are on the political left or right, are liberal in this sense. Right? And a core set of values, I think, sits at the center of it all. Obama puts it this way. This is from The Audacity of Hope. The value of self-reliance and self-improvement and risk-taking, he writes. the values of drive, discipline, temperance, and hard work, the values of thrift and personal responsibility. These values are rooted in a basic optimism about life and a faith in free will, a confidence that through pluck and sweat and smarts, each of us can rise above the circumstances of our birth. Our system of self-government and our free market economy depend on the majority of the individual Americans adhering to these values. The legitimacy of our government and our economy depend on the degree to which these values are rewarded, which is why the values of equal opportunity and non-discrimination complement rather than impinge on our liberty. Obama expresses these views as a kind of consensus which harkens back to the post-war liberal consensus of the mid-20th century, a common set of values that connects us and enables us, despite our differences, to hold a jointly shared view or vision of the country. And he believes these shared values, the standards and principles that the majority of Americans deem important in their lives and in the life of the country, should be at the heart of our politics. So Obama, in my mind, is a certain kind of black liberal. Now, black liberals generally hold basic liberal principles, but with the understanding that white supremacy and its habits undermine their application to all Americans. These persistent racist practices require a strong central government to check the arbitrary exercise of racial violence. So we can think of, for example, of the role of the National Guard in integrating Little Rock Central High School in 1957, or the federal marshals needed to enroll James Meredith in Ole Miss in 1961, just as examples, right? In each instance, federal power was deployed to protect black people. Of course, we can think of counterexamples where it wasn't, but this is just the point, right? White supremacy makes groups just as important as individuals, right? Because black people as a group, no matter if they are middle class or poor, face unequal treatment precisely because they're black. So black liberalism ostensibly separates liberal principles from white supremacy, holding that racism distorts the American idea. Right? The thought here is that if African Americans were woven into the fabric of American life, that inclusion would fundamentally transform America. Now, some trace this idea back to the early 19th century in the writings of Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists. Theirs, in my view, I think theirs is more Republican than liberal when we can parse that distinction. I think we see the foundations more clearly at work in the NAACP and other civil rights organizations of the 1940s and 50s, and we certainly see it used throughout the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Dr. King and other movement activists repeatedly pointed out the failure of the nation to live up to its principles when it came to black people, and they invoked the idea of common American values as the basis of their criticism. The underlying assumption here is that the American idea is not inherently bad or in need of revision. It isn't racist, rather we are the racist and are in need of redemption. We simply need to align our practices with our stated principles and values, and this view enables us to hold simultaneously that the principles of freedom and liberty are already a part of American life, while we experience over and over again habits and practices that suggest otherwise. In this sense, the black liberal argument is and always will be an argument about America on the terms of its stated creed. The different forms of African American politics have been based on the degree to which one accepts the terms of that creed. Black nationalists reject it out of hand. Black socialists and communists see it as a ruse to hide the horrors of racial capitalism. Black liberals, especially President Obama, tend to accept, or their politics seem to suggest as much, the American idea, straight, no chaser. Right? Straight, no chaser. That's how I like my whiskey, too. Different kinds of black liberals hold this view today. You know, if you read Black Visions and Dawson, he has radical egalitarianism and disillusioned liberals and conservatives. I'm kind of riffing on this in a very different way. Right? The Reverend Jesse Jackson and U.S. Representatives John Lewis and Maxine Waters come to mind as examples of traditional black liberals. These are people committed to the American idea and to equality irrespective of the color of your skin or how much money you have. They criticize the various ways white supremacy as individual acts of prejudice and as structural inequality undermine democratic life in this country. And they insist on robust federal protection and intervention to prevent and remedy racial discrimination. In short, traditional black liberals believe the problem rests with the gap between our ideals and practices, a problem best resolved by strong state government. Right? There's this wonderful line from Dawson where he says, black liberals have had the difficult task of convincing African Americans that their collective vision was achievable within America, while at the same time trying to convince the rest of the country that only by embracing the widest vision of freedom and equality could America, in fact, fulfill its obligation to its black citizens and by extension redeem itself. This kind of paradox, this irony that's at the heart of it. Think of John Lewis, for example, in response to the demonstrations in Ferguson, Missouri after the murder of Mike Brown, and I say murder, said on MSNBC, quote, "My own feeling right now is that the president should use the authority of his office to declare martial law, federalize the Missouri National Guard to protect people as they protest," end quote. Just found that ironic coming out of John Lewis's mouth. For him and other traditional liberals, the principles of fairness and egalitarianism dictate the role of government in our lives, and the idea of justice is as important as the principle of liberty. These notions, along with the core values of the country that Obama evoked in the passage that I read, shape how traditional black liberals engage with economic, social, and racial issues. So there's the traditional black liberal, as I lay out in the book. And then there are the conservative black liberals, right? People like Clarence Thomas and Shelby Still, and y'all know some folks like that in California, don't you? Ben Carson. All of these folk hold steadfast to the American idea and to notions of black self-reliance. So conservative black liberals laud markets and insist that racism, if it persists at all, is a matter only of individual acts of prejudice. Like traditional black liberals, they believe the problem is a gap between our ideals and our actions, but they don't believe government can close the gap. For them, a commitment to the values of hard work and personal responsibility ensure black progress, not a strong federal government that they think encourages dependency. In fact, in the minds of most conservative black liberals, big government, strong state government, does more harm than good. Now, between conservative and traditional black liberals, I argue in Democracy in Black, stand the post-black liberal. The post-black liberal. These are people who believe, I'm boring the hell out of myself, y'all. Melvin, I just want to come out here and start talking. But I'm trying to perform for you. Okay. It's for you. These are people who believe in the American idea and acknowledge the history of racism, but de-emphasize its current relevance and appeal to ideas of efficient government in partnership with the private sector as a remedy for social ills. Post-black liberals recognize the legacy of racial discrimination, but also insist on personal responsibility and accountability. They have a faith in markets, as conservative black liberals do, and they don't believe government has all the answers to the problems of black communities. They split the difference then between traditional and conservative black liberals as they appeal not to a totally colorblind America, but to an America in which race doesn't really matter as much. You know, Obama's obviously one, and I'm thinking about Cory Booker and a few others as examples of the post-black liberal. In this sense, post-black liberals can be thought of as race transcenders of a sort, of a kind, right? They acknowledge race only to point to our need to get beyond race. Right? Now, President Obama captured that general philosophy, the general philosophy of the post-black liberal, in his speech commemorating the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma. Now, I have this habit when I hear Obama commemorating moments in our struggle of throwing my shoe at the television. Right? But listen at this passage. The Americans who crossed this bridge were not physically imposing, but they gave courage to millions. They held no elected office, but they led a nation. What could be more American than what happened in this place? What could more profoundly vindicate the idea of America than plain and humble people coming together to shape their country's course? What greater expression of faith in the American experiment than this? What greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is in our power to remake this nation to more closely align with our highest ideals, end quote. Post-black liberals at their best, straight no chaser. Racial matters enter in as a momentary stumble on our way to a more perfect union. Here the American idea reigns supreme, or minimally is redeemed, right? The promise of America is redeemed through our actions and sacrifice. The black freedom struggle becomes in some ways an exemplification of America's greatness. Right? But black liberalism of whatever stripe comes with a cruel irony, I maintain. The demands for racial reform dovetail all too easily with the American fantasy that black people will disappear. The Vanishing Act would be a part of a broader idea of America, right? Where the ugliness of past practices gives way to a more perfect union, and where the language of national consensus limits what can be said about black suffering. Again, Obama made this move in the audacity of hope and has governed by it for 2 terms. Listen to Obama. An emphasis on universal as opposed to race-specific programs isn't just good policy, it's also good politics. Rightly or wrongly, white guilt has largely exhausted itself in America. Even the most fair-minded of whites, those who would genuinely like to see inequality ended and poverty relieved, tend to push back against suggestions of racial victimization or race-specific claims based on the history of race discrimination in this country. As a result, proposals that solely benefit minorities and dissect Americans into us and them may generate a few short-term concessions when the costs to whites aren't too high, but they can't serve as the basis for the kinds of sustained, broad-based political coalitions needed to transform America, end quote. And as I was rereading that this morning, I was thinking about Charles Mills's work in Occupy Liberalism, where he tries to kind of embrace a kind of strategic liberalism, right? We embrace its principles in order to, in some ways, expand, right, this notion of freedom and equality. In other words, consensus, at least the way I'm reading Obama here, consensus requires that the particulars of black people's suffering are left at the door, are left behind. The particulars of black people's suffering are left behind. And he just simply doesn't note the irony, right, that to acknowledge black suffering triggers, right, white racism. Right? And the fact that it triggers white racism, right, dictates how we, in some ways, reflect on black suffering, how we address it, which leaves white racism in interesting sorts of ways, intact and untouched, if that makes any sense. Now, this is a version, I believe, I'm not going to be able to get through all this. This is a version Ralph Bunche, the noted political scientist who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950, put forward in his 1949 commencement address at Fisk. The Negro graduates of Fisk University are better Americans than they are Negroes, he wrote. They are Negro primarily in a negative sense. They reject that sort of treatment that deprives them of their birthright, right? As Americans, remove that treatment and their identification as Negroes in American society would become meaningless, at least as meaningless as it is to be of English or French or German or Italian ancestry. On its face, this seems like a laudable goal, to be treated as an American, to be judged by the content of one's character alone. This is the hope of colorblindness, yes? But this state of affairs requires that we leave our identification as Negroes at the doorstep. Remember that moment in 1955 in James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son in the essay, Many Thousands Gone. We must wash ourselves blank. We must become blank in order to wash away your guilt. We have to become blank. We have to leave the particulars of who we are at the doorstep. It also demands that we believe that being American is not inextricably bound to the idea that white people are valued most in this country, that our inclusion depends on our ability to successfully model ourselves on white people. This denial limits the scope of black protest. All we're left to do is to protest that we have failed to live up to our ideals or demand just laws while the value gap is left untouched. Our entree into American society is not only contingent on the eradication of racism, but also on the disappearance of black people altogether. Black people must lose their blackness. If I follow the logic of black liberalism, they must lose their blackness if America is to be transformed. But of course, white people get to stay white. Yeah? Now, this is the devastating irony that rests at the heart of black liberalism. The quest to align black freedom with the ideals of America contains within it a death warrant for black America itself. Du Bois saw the implications of this view in 1925. He asked, what do we want? What is the thing we are after? It has a certain truth, he writes. We want to be Americans, full-fledged Americans with all the rights of other American citizens. But is that all? Do we simply want to be Americans? Once in a while, through all of us, there flashes some clairvoyance, some clear idea of what America really is. We who are dark see America in a way that Americans cannot. And seeing our country thus, are we satisfied with its present ideals? Okay. We don't want to integrate into America as it is. We don't believe white people possess something of intrinsic value that we need or desperately want. Our aim is not to corroborate the value of whiteness by desiring its status and benefits. Something more fundamental is at stake in our claim on America, or at least it should be. And that something is deeply connected to our experiences as black people in the United States, the consequence of a society committed to the idea of white people. We know in some ways what democracy can be because we have viscerally felt what it is not. But there is the idea, and it has been a feature of post-war American liberalism since the beginning of the Cold War, that the price of wholesale inclusion in this society is that we actively forget we are black people, that we become just Americans while white people continue to benefit from being white. And the irony, of course, is that this active forgetting, this disremembering, this epistemic ignorance is one of the crucial ways white supremacy in the 21st century sustains itself. And ironically, black liberalism has helped it, that is, white supremacy, the value gap, stay alive. Now, of course, black politics hasn't always been tethered to the American idea. As you can tell, I don't care about making people uncomfortable, right? That's what you get when you get tenure. Prior to the advent of the Cold War, black activists imagined black politics in domestic and global terms. They envisioned the struggle of black people in America as intimately and philosophically linked to struggles of other oppressed people around the world. The American idea was given life, was given the lie by its connection to the unfreedom enforced upon much of the globe by colonialism and imperialism. Even black liberals then leveraged geopolitical matters for the benefit of African Americans at home. They argued for broad-based citizenship rights as they fought Jim Crow in the South and connected the struggle to the liberation of Africans and Asians everywhere. The anthem of Lift Every Voice and Sing, Shana Redmond, written and composed by James Weldon Johnson and his brother J. Rosamond Johnson, right, celebrated a distinctiveness that could not be contained by U.S. borders. So in the first 4 decades of the 20th century, black liberals argued for the vote, insisted on self-reliance and economic independence, organized Pan-African conferences and congresses, and dared to imagine America on different terms. Even a young Du Bois, before his embrace of communism, voiced in 1903 the distinctive approach of black liberals that rejected the idea of America as the shining city upon the hill, as Ronald Reagan did to reprise John Winthrop's notion of America as the city upon the hill. Your country, how came it yours, Du Bois said. Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we brought our 3 gifts and mingled them with yours, a gift of story and song, the gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weak hands could have done it. The third, a gift of spirit. Are not these gifts worth giving? Is not this work and striving? Would America have been America without her Negro people? Here, Du Bois, a young Du Bois, insists on a different vision of the country, one that isn't predicated on the idea that America is God's chosen nation. Instead, the experiences of black people are the basis for a radical imagining of what America is and what the country might be. Obama is not this kind of black liberal. For him, if the distinctiveness of black folk is to be mentioned at all, it is only to confirm the greatness of our country. What choices were made to yoke black liberalism to the American idea? What happened to make post-black liberals like President Obama possible? 3 historic moments, I say in the book, set the stage for this shift, and they, along with the demands for Cold War consensus, discursively narrowed the range of black politics. So in the book, I talk about the Black Liberal Compact, thinking about what happened with the meeting between Truman in 1948, right, thinking about the difference between Du Bois and Paul Robeson's meeting and Walter White's meeting and how this narrows. So if you read Carol Anderson's work or Penny von Eschen's work, you get this story of how a choice was made and how that choice, in light of the ongoing disciplining procedural work of Cold War liberalism, narrowed the range of African American politics in one sense. I talk about a strategy of deracialization, right? This moment, so I'm trying to rush through this. This moment in the 1970s, right, when Charles V. Hamilton, who co-wrote with Stokely Carmichael, Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, authored a position paper for the National Democratic Party and put forward the answer. He put forward an answer to the problem that the Democratic Party faced. He argued that in light of Richard Nixon's victory in 1972 and the white backlash engulfing the nation, that the Democratic Party, if it was to have any chance in the 1976 presidential election, had to change the way in which it engaged race. He advised the party, and particularly black political candidates, to de-emphasize racial matters. This is the co-author of Black Power. And to promote universal issues that connected different constituencies. In 1973, for example, he recommended that the issue of full employment applied to the total society, not only to blacks and other traditionally stigmatized minorities, be placed at the forefront. All who suffered from the economic downturn would support such measures. The underlying assumption is that those politicians who deracialized actually were planning to work for progressive policies that would help black communities. But the strategy didn't work. Even as African Americans appeared to make political gains, broader constituencies eventually elected black politicians. Think about Douglas Wilder in Virginia, Carol Moseley Braun in Illinois, David Dinkins in New York, and eventually Deval Patrick in Massachusetts. But the value gap and racial habits persisted, distorting the political process. Large numbers of white working-class Democrats bolted to Ronald Reagan in 1980. Bill Clinton sought to assure those Reagan Democrats that he was not beholden to the traditional Democratic base, as his strategy of triangulation pulled the party to the center right of the ideological spectrum. We see something similar with Hillary Clinton at a different register. We can argue about that if you want. Deracialization became the handcuffs everyone should have seen it to be from the start. Right? We get what Frederick Harris calls a wink and nod politics. You know, you got these folks saying to black voters, you know we got your back, but we can't really address you. And so we have to then assume that they are acting in our interest. And this deepens what Adolph Reed talked about as this kind of problematic custodial model of leadership. Another feature, another coordinate that led to the kind of deepening of this black liberalism was the two campaigns of Jesse Jackson, were the two campaigns of Jesse Jackson, one in '84 and the other in '88. We can talk about that over Q&A because I've bored myself. I really have. Because something is more at stake than this. You see? The stakes are much higher than just simply an analytical an analysis of the failures and shortcomings of black liberalism. I'm trying to open up space for a reimagining of African American politics, right? Where 1,000 blossoms, 1,000 blooms, right? It's a kind of butcher mouths formulation. But part of what I'm arguing with the '84, '88 campaigns, is that Jackson effectively yokes the black freedom struggle to the Democratic Party. To the Democratic Party. These three historical moments, the Black Liberal Compact of 1946 and 48, the strategy of deracialization of 1976, and the Jesse Jackson campaigns of '84 and '88, I'm coming home, illustrate how black liberalism became the dominant, if not the only, discursive political game in town. The triumph of black liberalism happened, and in some ways was made possible by as the material conditions of black life deteriorated and as the institutional life of black America collapsed. In other words, traditional and now post-black liberals have been on watch in all phases of black life as elected representatives in state houses and in Congress, as mayors, as protest leaders, as members of long-standing civil rights organizations, and now as president, at the very moment black America is suffering a slow and agonizing death. I think we should free our political imaginations from this stranglehold. This has been particularly the case this election cycle. We witnessed during the Democratic primary The traditional black political class aligned itself with the Clinton campaign, especially in the South, constituting the firewall that sealed her nomination. Much of what Bernie Sanders argued for would have fundamentally affected the life circumstances of black communities. Instead, we witnessed over and over again the elision of what has historically been called black politics and the politics of the Democratic Party. Let me say this more forcefully. We saw the obfuscating work of the distinction between the black political class as representatives of something distinctively called black politics and the Democratic Party establishment. And to my mind, there is no substantive difference to be noted between the two. There's no substantive difference to be noted between James Clyburn and Donna Brazile as black politics and the Democratic Party. There's no distinction. And we must be mindful that when we make that distinction, as we are prone to do, we fog up the political landscape. One of the effects of all of this has been, in my view, an interesting dampening of critical deliberation around Clinton's candidacy, although we see some effects. Not noted during the primary when black millennials were not voting for her at the highest number in those numbers that they were attributing to black voters. We see this in early voting, particularly places like Florida, where we've seen a decrease in the numbers. Of course, that has something to do with the wild benchmarking of the 2008 and 2012 elections with Obama on the ticket. But there is, I think, deep-seated skepticism in black communities about the ways in which Hillary Clinton engages our communities. We also see this happening in interesting sorts of ways as the Black Lives Matter movement ideologically differentiates with the recent kind of interesting staging of DeRay McKesson and Brittany Packnett's endorsement of Hillary Clinton, right? They meet with Clinton. Brittany then does an interview with Melissa Harris Perry in Elle magazine, and then DeRay writes an op-ed in the Washington Post, basically both saying that they were with her, and kind of distinguishing that move from the Movement for Black Lives Policy platform, which offers a broader vision of black politics, which tries in interesting sorts of ways to reclaim, right, the radical tradition that has been relentlessly under assault. The fact remains, even with the obvious danger of a Trump presidency, some black voters, including myself, are deeply skeptical of Hillary Clinton and believe, as I do, that she engages black communities in bad faith. And the problem, of course, returns us to where we began. That the all-out assault on our radical imaginations, I've since added an adjective here, has the effect of narrowing what we see as politically possible. Instead of taking this moment as an opportunity to push open political possibilities, radical possibilities, many of us, and it is an understandable choice, are settling for the lesser of two evils. Well, our dead and the ongoing devastation that surrounds us and time require much more of us. We have some really difficult days ahead, and we have to be open to return to Emerson, to the hints and the omens and the inferences and the dark resemblances in the objects lying around us. We must understand that the imagination is a critical battleground. For as James Baldwin wrote in 1961, the liberation of Americans from the anguish which has crippled us for so long can only mean truly the creation of a new people in this still new world. Thank you.